Under the cold light of twin moons, the colony square looked more like a place of punishment than a place of survival, and the people of Earth who lived there had long grown used to standing in line for scraps handed out by their alien overseers. But on this night something different happened, something that would echo in whispers long after, for among the hungry and the desperate stood a thin woman with hollow cheeks and weary eyes, a child clinging to her side with tiny arms, his lips dry from thirst and his body trembling from weakness, and when the guards threw away the last container of spoiled rations into a waste bin, she stepped forward, her voice breaking the silence with words that made many heads turn. "Please, may I have the leftovers for my child?" At first no one dared breathe, for speaking directly to the alien guards was dangerous, but her words hung heavy in the air, carrying more weight than the scattered food ever could, and the guards, towering beings with scaled skin that shimmered under the moons, tilted their heads and let out a sound that was almost laughter, cruel and sharp, mocking her plea as though it were the funniest thing they had ever heard, and one of them kicked the bin so that the rotten rations spilled into the dirt, sneering, "Leftovers are for rats, not for you." The woman, whose name was Alara, did not flinch, though inside her heart beat like a drum, for she had not eaten in 3 days and her child had eaten even less, but she would not turn away without trying, so she knelt in the dirt, reaching for even the smallest scrap, and the guard's boot came down, scattering the food farther, forcing her hand back, and the people around her lowered their eyes, afraid that if they looked too long, they too would be punished. Yet something stirred within them. Something they had not felt in years. Shame, not at Alara's action, but at their own silence. The child whimpered softly, and Alara pulled him close, whispering words of comfort she did not believe, words about tomorrow, about hope, about a better day that might come, though she knew tomorrow would look exactly the same as today, unless something changed. Hidden in the shadow of a broken wall, an old man named Marcus watched this unfold, his eyes narrowing as he remembered a different time, when humans had not been so quiet, when they had fought tooth and nail for every piece of ground, and though his back was bent and his hands rough from years of labor, something inside him refused to let go of what he had seen, for Alara's plea was more than desperation. It was a spark, small but dangerous, like the first flicker of fire in dry grass. The guards eventually turned away, losing interest, their cruel laughter fading as they returned to their patrol, and the crowd dispersed slowly, heads bowed, too afraid to speak of what had happened, but Marcus remained in the shadows, watching Alara as she carried her child back to the makeshift shelter she called home, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion yet still holding an invisible weight of dignity, and he knew that such a moment could not be forgotten, not if humanity was to survive. In that silence, as the wind swept through the square and carried with it the faint smell of spoiled food, Marcus made a decision he had avoided for years, a decision that might cost him his life, but one he could no longer escape, for the woman's voice had reminded him of something he thought had died long ago, the belief that humans were not meant to crawl, but to stand. Marcus could not sleep that night, for the image of the woman kneeling in the dirt and the sound of her trembling plea echoed in his mind like a voice from the past, dragging him back to the years when he had worn a soldier's uniform and stood among men who believed humanity would never bow. Yet now he saw his people bent, broken, and silent, surviving on scraps as though survival alone was enough, and he knew in his bones that this was not the life they were meant to live. So as the colony slept in its restless misery, he rose quietly from his corner and walked the narrow alleys where crumbling walls leaned against each other like old men too weak to stand, and he thought of Alara's eyes, hollow yet filled with something stubborn that hunger could not erase, and he wondered if she herself knew what she had ignited. The next morning he began to speak in whispers, not loudly, not recklessly, but carefully, choosing those he had once trusted or those who still carried a spark of defiance in their gaze, telling them of what he had seen, of the way one woman's words had struck him like a hammer, and though most turned away in fear, unwilling to risk the little safety they had, a few lingered, listening, and in their hesitation he saw hope. Days passed, and Marcus gathered them in secret places, under broken machinery, in abandoned tunnels beneath the colony, places the alien guards never cared to search, and there he reminded them of old truths, that humans had faced extinction before and had survived, not because they were the strongest, but because they refused to give up, and though his voice was rough with age, it carried weight, for he spoke not of glory but of necessity, of children who cried from hunger and mothers who begged for scraps while others turned their eyes away. Among those who listened, Alara came, not out of pride but because she had nothing left to lose, and when Marcus asked her to tell them what she had said to the guards, she repeated her words, soft yet steady. "Please, may I have the leftovers for my child?" And the silence that followed was heavier than any speech Marcus could have given. For in that moment they all understood it was not weakness but courage that had carried those words. The courage to speak when silence was safer. Marcus then told them that one spark could light a fire, and a fire could spread through the whole colony if only they dared to feed it. But he also warned them that the cost would be high, that the aliens would not sit idle if humans rose from their knees, yet his warning did not scatter them. Instead, it bound them together, because for the first time in years they felt something more dangerous than fear, they felt possibility. When they left that hidden place, their eyes were sharper, their steps more certain, and though they carried no weapons, Marcus could see the beginnings of an army in their faces. Not an army of soldiers but an army of the desperate, the hungry, and the forgotten, and he knew the time of silence was ending. The nights grew colder in the colony, and though hunger gnawed at every stomach, a different hunger now stirred in the shadows, one that no alien overseer could measure or silence, for Marcus had begun shaping his small group into something more than frightened survivors, and every secret meeting added a new thread to a web of defiance that spread quietly beneath the eyes of their masters. Yet still he knew whispers alone could not change their fate, so he began to teach them, not in grand speeches but in patient lessons drawn from his years as a soldier, showing them how to move unseen in the alleys, how to mark the guards' patrol routes, how to turn simple tools into weapons when no blades or guns were allowed. And though many hands shook with weakness, determination made them steady, and the people who had once lowered their eyes now began to look around with sharper focus, as though every shadow held opportunity. Ilara came to every gathering, carrying her child close, and though she had never lifted a weapon, Marcus saw in her a strength that could not be taught, for she endured not for herself but for the boy who clung to her hand, and that unbroken spirit gave courage to others, for when fear threatened to swallow them, they thought of her voice in the square and remembered that a plea, when spoken at the right moment, could shake even the coldest hearts. The group grew slowly, just a few at first, then a handful more, each bringing scraps of knowledge. How to slip past alien eyes, how to smuggle food from storage, how to spread rumors in ways that inspired hope instead of panic. And together they formed a fragile bond that the aliens had never imagined possible, for the oppressors believed hunger had crushed all spirit, and in their arrogance they no longer watched humans closely, certain that a people who begged for scraps could never dream of resistance. Marcus, however, knew time was thin, for a spark left untended could fade, and he wanted the people to understand discipline, not just passion, so he tested them with small tasks, asking one to shadow a guard for a full night without being seen, another to map the supply routes, another to hide a stolen tool and keep it safe, and when each returned with success, their faces glowed with a pride none had felt in years, the pride of taking back even the smallest measure of control. Yet still, beneath the hope, there was fear, and it pressed down on them like the heavy skies above, for they all knew the aliens were cruel, and discovery would mean punishment beyond imagining. But Marcus did not let that silence them. Instead he spoke of the old wars, of how humans had always been underestimated, of how strength was not in size or power but in the refusal to surrender. And when he saw their eyes harden with quiet resolve, he knew the colony had begun to change, not in loud rebellion, not yet, but in the silent gathering of courage, the kind that grows slowly until it cannot be contained. And so, in the darkness of that forgotten world, a mother's plea and an old soldier's memory wove together into something dangerous, a hidden strength waiting for the moment to rise, and though the aliens laughed in their towers, believing the humans broken, the truth was already shifting beneath their feet, and the colony itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the storm that Marcus knew was coming. The first act of defiance came quietly, almost like a whisper in the night, yet its echo would be felt through every corner of the colony, for Marcus had decided the group could no longer practice only in secret. They needed to act, even if the act was small, and so he led them to the edge of the supply yard where spoiled rations were thrown out, food that the aliens would not eat but would rather let rot than allow humans to have, and under the cover of broken shadows the group crept forward, their hearts pounding, every step feeling heavier than chains, for they all knew if they were caught the punishment would not simply fall upon them but upon their families as well, yet hunger gave them courage, and the thought of children with hollow eyes pushed them onward. Ilara held her child close as she watched from a distance, not fighting this night but standing guard with a handful of others, her gaze steady though fear coiled tight in her chest, and when Marcus and the younger men reached the bin, they worked quickly, scooping what they could into hidden sacks before scattering to the shadows again. It was not much, molded bread, bruised fruit, grain damp with rot, but to starving stomachs it was life, and as the food was carried back to the hidden tunnel, Marcus felt a strange heat in his chest, not pride, not victory, but something stronger, the knowledge that they had taken something the aliens had denied them, and that denial had always been the chains binding them. That night, the food was shared among families who had not tasted a full meal in days, and though no songs were sung and no cheers rose up, the silence of chewing, the wide eyes of children, the trembling smiles of mothers, spoke louder than any celebration could, and the people began to whisper that perhaps the aliens were not untouchable after all. But the act did not go unnoticed forever, for the guards, puzzled at missing scraps and signs of disturbance, began to question if vermin were crawling too close to their supply lines, and though they dismissed it as a minor nuisance, their suspicion grew, and soon patrols doubled, lights swept the yards, and harsh orders were barked at any human who lingered too near. Marcus knew this was inevitable, but he also knew it was necessary, for the people could no longer survive on silence alone, and now the risk was greater than ever, yet in the eyes of those who had eaten, he saw something he had not seen in years: resolve. Ilara's child slept with a full belly for the first time in weeks, and when she looked at Marcus, her gratitude was wordless but deep, and he knew that even this small victory had struck a chord in her that could never be undone. In the following days, more joined the hidden gatherings, not because they had been asked, but because they wanted to be part of whatever force had dared to steal from the hands of their oppressors, and Marcus welcomed them, though he warned them of what was coming, for he was certain the aliens would grow harsher, and when they did, the choice to remain hidden or to rise would have to be made. And so, the colony stood on the edge of something fragile and dangerous, like a glass vessel filled to the brim, trembling at the slightest touch, waiting for the moment when silence would shatter into open defiance, and every man, woman, and child felt it, even if they did not speak it aloud. The storm was approaching, and there would be no turning back once it broke. The air inside the colony grew heavier with every passing day after the stolen food was shared, for though no guard had yet uncovered the truth, the aliens began to sense unrest, and their suspicion turned into harsher orders, longer patrols, and crueler punishments for the smallest mistakes, and this constant tension pushed the humans closer to the edge of breaking, yet instead of crushing them, it only deepened the fire Marcus had seen in their eyes, for he knew the aliens believed fear was a weapon that could silence all resistance, but in truth fear, when pressed too hard, could harden into courage, and that was what he began to witness around him. Ilara became the quiet symbol of that courage, for though the guards singled her out, questioning her in front of others, trying to force her into submission with threats against her child, she refused to bend, answering only with silence or with words so plain they revealed nothing. And those who watched her endure began to believe that perhaps strength did not always come from fists or weapons, but from an unbroken spirit that would not yield no matter the weight placed upon it. Marcus knew they could not remain in the shadows much longer, for every whisper of rebellion carried the risk of betrayal, every stolen scrap risked discovery, and every passing day brought new hunger, new despair, so he began to prepare them for something greater, something louder, something that would show the aliens they had misjudged the people they thought beaten. The group trained more boldly now, using abandoned workshops where they learned to strike with hammers and pipes, to move in silence even as their hearts thundered, to pass messages under the noses of the guards, and Marcus told them plainly that the time for testing was ending, that soon they would have to show the overseers they were not shadows to be brushed aside but a force that demanded to be seen. Still, he warned them of the cost, for he remembered battles where victory was painted in blood, and he told them that freedom never came without sacrifice. But instead of retreating, their eyes grew steadier, their voices stronger, and their silence more dangerous than any shout. Ilara listened carefully to every plan, holding her child close while Marcus spoke of the next step, and though fear lived in her, she did not let it rule her, for she had seen what hunger did to her boy, and she knew that to remain still was to slowly watch him fade, and that thought gave her strength sharper than steel. The night before the planned action, Marcus stood before the group in the flickering light of a smuggled lamp, his face lined with years of battles and losses, and he said to them in a voice that carried like iron, "One plea awakened us, but one act will remind them we are not broken." And in the silence that followed, no one turned away, not one soul fled, for they all understood that the moment had come, and though fear wrapped around their throats, they swallowed it, choosing resolve instead. Outside, the colony seemed almost too quiet, as if the air itself held its breath, and Marcus felt in his bones that what they were about to do would change everything, for better or for worse, and the thought of it sent a shiver through even his battle-worn heart. Yet he would not retreat, for he knew that sometimes a single night could decide the future of an entire people, and this night was theirs to claim. The morning of the food distribution came with a strange stillness, as if the very ground beneath the colony knew what was about to happen, and the humans who usually shuffled into the square with bowed heads and empty hands now moved with a hidden purpose, their eyes lowered as always, but their steps more certain, for Marcus and his group were among them, waiting for the signal that would turn silence into thunder. And Elara stood near the front with her child clutching her arm, her face pale, but unflinching, knowing she was not only a mother this day but also a voice that had awakened something greater than herself. The alien guards took their places, towering with arrogance, their scaled skin catching the pale light of the moons, their weapons gleaming as they barked orders, confident as ever that the humans would obey, for in their eyes humans were weak, broken, too hungry to resist. But when the first container of rations was dropped into the dirt with deliberate cruelty, Marcus stepped forward, not to beg, not to plead, but to stand tall. And for the first time in years a human did not move aside when ordered, and the guards, startled, demanded he step back. Instead, Marcus raised his voice so all could hear, a voice rough with age yet strong enough to cut through the square, declaring, "We are not beggars. We are not broken. Today we take what is ours." At that moment the hidden tools came out, pipes, hammers, sharpened scraps of metal, and the humans surged forward, not with blind rage but with the strength of the desperate, and the guards, caught off guard, stumbled as the first blows landed. Chaos erupted as shouts filled the air, the crowd once silent now alive with fury and hope, children pulled back into safety by mothers while men and women pushed forward, striking against the very chains that had bound them. Elara did not raise a weapon, but she stood firm with her child behind her, her voice crying out above the noise, calling others to join, and her words, though simple, carried like fire. "Stand! Stand for your children!" The aliens tried to regain control, their weapons sparking with energy, but the humans were too many, and for the first time the guards realized the mistake they had made, not in underestimating hunger, but in underestimating hope, for a starving people who believe in nothing will crawl, but a starving people who believe in each other will rise like a storm. The battle raged through the square, rough and chaotic, yet every strike, every shout, every defiant step forward carried the weight of years of suffering, and when the last of the guards fell back, retreating with curses and promises of return, the humans stood breathless, bloodied, but unbowed, and in the silence that followed, all eyes turned to Marcus, whose chest heaved with exhaustion, and to Elara, who stood with her child clinging to her side. No longer the woman who once begged for scraps but the mother whose voice had lit the fire that burned across the colony. No songs were sung, no cheers rang out, for they all knew the battle ahead would be harder, the retaliation fiercer, yet something greater had been born that day, something the aliens could never erase, for humanity had risen not with machines or armies but with unity, with courage, with the simple truth that dignity could not be stolen forever, and as the people gathered around Elara and Marcus, their hearts beating as one, the colony itself seemed to tremble, not with fear this time, but with the promise of freedom waiting just beyond the horizon.